Hi, I'm Russ Gaskin with Co-Creative. Today we're focusing on collaborative innovation, specifically how to leverage five critical tensions that tend to show up in any multi-stakeholder collaboration. In the word collaborative innovation is a polarity or creative tension because often in the past collaboration has meant least common denominator kind of approaches or outcomes. And innovation has often been equated with some individual super smart designer person who made some brilliant breakthrough. And we think that the best innovation and the best collaboration brings these two things together and leverages the strength of each. So even in the core kind of frame on the work that we do at Co-Creative, there's a polarity at the core of it. So we wanted to share a bit here about how we use polarity thinking and this idea of these positive, constructive, creative design tensions in our work. Share some of the methods and tools related to that, particularly very practical ways we use it in our work, and then share other resources and ideas, as I mentioned. So this is a bit about Co-Creative. Obviously, you can read for yourself, so I'm not going to say too much more about this. But one of the things that's unusual in some ways about Co-Creative is that we actively support the development of other consultancies who do what we do. So in a way, we like to create competitors because we think that this space needs more capacity and expertise brought to the table. And in the broader spirit of that, we also give away all of the tools and methods that we use. So anything that we might reference here, it's either already on our website or it's available. So please let us know if we mention something and you're unable to find it.
So here's what we're planning to cover on the call today. One, we wanted to play with some of the polarities that show up in our work so that we can all begin to sort of build our competencies around being able to see polarities when they are at play. And we believe that this is useful because then if we can increase our awareness about polarities, we can also increase our awareness about our own preferences and our corresponding blind spots. And we'll get into more about what that's all about on the call. And then finally, we're going to close out this session with looking at some sort of patterns that regularly emerge, some consistent dynamics that emerge when we start to look at group dynamics from a polarity perspective. So this, I realize, is Pacific Coast time centric in terms of our timing, but this is the general flow of the call today. So post introductions and what we're going to be doing today, we'll get into a bit of context about polarities. Then we'll play with some pretty common ones that turn up in work. We'll let's do some work around sketching those polarities, sort of the upsides and downsides of each of those interdependent values, and then talk through a little bit about how we aim to leverage them, and close no later than 12:30. We have found on other webinars that we've done that there's always a few folks who would love to hang on a little bit longer and have a chat. And so we anticipate being able to do that on this call if that's of interest to folks.
So I want to note too, before we go forward, I mentioned Cliff Kaiser, who's on the call as well, who kind of joined as a guest, but we're calling him out as an expert. And so at a few times, we're also going to see if what's coming up for Cliff, because he's more on the cutting edge of polarity thinking and always has some new information, context, perspectives, insights, and more to bring to the work. So thank you, Cliff, for joining and for sharing.
Do you want to, Cliff, are you willing to do an intro right now?
Oh, sure.
Thanks.
Well, I was intrigued by this webinar. First of all, I love to see people talking about polarities. And so I was curious to see how you were framing it. And in particular, I'm so intrigued by the work that Russ has been doing and Co-Creative has been doing for many years around stakeholder engagement. And I think that, that's so critical to leveraging polarities, because if you don't have a diverse group of key stakeholders talking about these tensions, you can get into real trouble. And I think that's in some ways a vulnerability to our own process at Polarity Partnerships. So I've been with Polarity Partnerships since 2012, working with Dr. Barry Johnson and others, and recently started a nonprofit, the Institute for Polarities of Democracy. And one of the challenges that I find is this, how to engage key stakeholders. And so I need to learn. So that's why I'm here really as a learner, but I appreciate, you engaging me as a somewhat facilitator. That wasn't my intention for joining, but I'm happy to offer any insights if I have any. But that's probably enough about me.
So another good polarity, we are all learners and we are all teachers.
There you go.
Thanks, Cliff. All right, so the bit of context that we promised. So when we're doing this work around collaborative innovation, we've consistently noticed some key patterns that have emerged and that we've leveraged in our work together. So we just wanted to walk through a few of them. So let's see. In terms of shifts, we usually sort of work with shifts around the system that we're working within. A shift, as we see it, is a statement of two different things. The first part of that statement is some statement about a piece of the system that's not working as we want it to, and how that part of the system should look in the future. So it's a two-part statement that describes really how things are now and how we want them to be into the future. Another pattern that we see in our work is this diverge, converge pattern. And we see this come up in a number of ways. There's times when we really want to open up our thinking, our analysis, we want to generate lots of possibilities and ideas. And there's other times in this work of sort of supporting collaboration across different stakeholders, where we want to start to support people to narrow their scope, to start to narrow in their analysis and begin to prioritize our ideas. And so this is a really natural pattern of diverging and converging. We also, as the topic of this call speaks to, we really sort of work with this pattern of dynamic tensions or polarities. So groups often experience tensions around different positions that they sort of see as mutually exclusive, as either or options. And when we start to see that or experience that, we really see that there could be sources of polarization, or groups get really stuck or sort of wrapped around the axle on these seemingly either or choices, particularly if we just let that play out under the surface. But we believe we can really frame these dynamic tensions or polarities as positive assets, that we can really help a group get the best of both of the sort of inherent interdependent values that are underneath those tensions. So we're obviously going to go a lot more deeper into that one today. Another pattern that we work with is, or see, is one that we call focus and frame. So when we're talking about focus, we're looking at that in terms of what's in scope of our work together, and frame is all of the other stuff or things that people care about that we still want to pay attention to as we pursue what's in focus. But it also helps us, if we're cognizant of what's in frame, it helps us avoid unintended consequences as we're sort of designing solutions together. The next pattern is the design squiggle. We know that when we're doing this kind of work around sort of creating systems change, it's pretty messy, and it is not a linear process. And so we really like to just let people know that before we even begin, so we can help socialize that idea of sort of there's unpredictability and uncertainty and a lot of emergence to this kind of work. And the last pattern we wanted to call out today was this notion of spiraling. So when we start to do work with collaborations, we really start to support folks to test and refine their shared intent together, their goals, their analysis, any potential shifts or solutions, first with a close-in group of sort of friendlies. And then over time, this consultation process really expands to people further out across the system. So we do have a blog post on this, a series on these patterns, and so there's more information that you can find there. And obviously for this call, we were focused in on the dynamic tensions.
Heather?
Yep.
So someone asked what a polarity is, and I thought this would be a good slide to use to give examples of polarities, but simply stated is a polarity is two values that often seem to be in opposition, and there's certainly a relationship between the two. And as we learn more about them, we discover that the two values are in fact interdependent, that we can't be successful in achieving a greater purpose without leveraging both of those values together. So if we just look here at our 6 patterns, we have this shift, which is a statement about the current state, how it is in the system, and a statement about how we want that part of the picture to look, or that part of the system to look in the future. So right there, we have a polarity of current and future. So what are we experiencing now? What do people want to be experiencing in the system? Diverging and converging, like when to do those, how to do both of those well in the work, another polarity. Focus and frame, so what we're focusing on and what's in the background that we may also pay attention to, there's another polarity. Design squiggle is a little bit trickier, I think, but I think that has to do with this kind of elemental polarity of order and chaos. Often in collaborations, people want to go straight for like just making decisions and going to order. But we think chaos and messiness and uncertainty and ambiguity have important roles to play, particularly in helping people to let go of their assumptions about what's true or what's needed in a system. And then spiraling, where we're talking to more people and connecting, is really a strategy that we use or a pattern that we employ for navigating between what I want as an individual and what we need as a network or a collaboration. So the spiraling is really between individual interests and collective interests. So again, you see that even in our 6 patterns, which seem to have nothing to do with polarities in some cases, there are polarities underlying each of them.
Right. So the concept of polarities are not new. The I Ching talks about yin and yang polarity, Lao Tzu about transcending dualistic thinking. This is just a list of many thinkers across time that have really lifted up the concept of polarities. Much later, we have Carl Jung talking about dualistic pairs and personalities, and then much more recently, we've got Dr. Barry Johnson's work on polarity management, along with all the work that Polarity Partnerships and Cliff has done to bring this dynamic into sort of our organizational development lexicon. So, in other words, it is not a flavor of the month. There's also work done by Donella Meadows and her seminal work on places that we can intervene in the system. The most impactful place being, as you see here, in the mindset or paradigm out of which a system arises, and also in this power to transcend paradigms. And so, we really feel like becoming aware of the polarities or dynamic tensions that are present in our work, we can start to sort of actively work to leverage or at least optimize them. And it's a powerful way to really change that either or thinking mindset, and can begin to open up ways to sort of start to transcend this dualistic thinking that really does lead to polarization that we probably have all experienced in different collaborations we've been a part of. So there are so many polarities. Here's just a few of them. A couple of points. The values in each of these pairs that you're seeing are interdependent. They really do need one another. And so to get the best of both, we really need both. You'll also notice that the way in which these polarities are framed, the values, the two values in each of those polarity pairs are both positive. So it's not like we're choosing between good and evil. There's no tension there. We're looking at, at least neutral values or positive values. And then polarities are what we think, and we welcome you to challenge us on this, but we really feel like polarities are the basis of most, if not all, organizational and network literature that's out there. And so, like I said, we're totally willing to be challenged on that.
Yeah, call us out on Twitter if you think there's a piece of literature in organization development, management, or networks that you think doesn't have a polarity in it, and we will find it. And it'll be meaningful.
Yeah. So just wanted to call it here, in terms of in order to get the best of both, we need both. So if you look at the polarity of activity and rest, when you, in order to really fully live into our full capacity to be active, imagine like doing a sport. We also need to be really well rested. Like by being rested, we're more able to, sort of, for me, like cycle and climb this really giant hill. At the same time, if I'm not really exerting myself actively, I'm not really also able to get the best of rest. Like I'm not actually tired. And so I'm sort of like restless at the end of the day. So we really, and when we're looking at all of these polarities, we are really seeing their interplay and how we can sort of optimize each of the values that are part of that polarity pair so we can get the best of them both. There's a ton of polarities with many values underneath them. Here's just a partial list. We started to collect them, and we do actually have a list. Russ, do you remember how many are on it right now?
542.
Right. So if anybody
and I'm sure
wants...
Cliff has a whole bunch more that I didn't even capture.
So if anybody wants that list, happy to share it. Wanted to pick up from Cliff and see if you have anything you want to add in terms of a bit of context for folks.
Oh no, this is great. I'm just enjoying the ride.
Cool. Russ?
All right, so we're gonna now play with polarities a little bit. So actually, Cliff, I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind doing the breathing thing since you were an originator of that, and we can actually draw it out as you walk the group through it.
Sure.
So we're going to share, for part of the webinar here, we're going to share an iPad, and so we can actually work in real time together.
So you want me to just walk everyone through this?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, why doesn't everybody on the count of three take a deep breath and hold it? 1, 2, 3, inhale and hold it. And so that probably feels pretty good. You've got a full lungs of oxygen, and that's actually the benefit of inhaling is you get oxygen. But the longer I sit here and talk, the more you're probably starting to feel a little bit of discomfort, which is too much carbon dioxide. So go ahead and let it out. Now, a lot of times people feel some real relief on the upside of the other pole. So at first we had too much carbon dioxide, and then on the exhale pole, we were able to get rid of that carbon dioxide. And that's the benefit that pole of exhale provides. It's a very unique benefit, in fact. So exhale gives you benefit of getting rid of carbon dioxide. But if you stopped there, you would have another problem in just not too much time. And it would be something along the lines of, and I'm just going to ask the group, if you stopped on the exhale pole and just got rid of all your CO2, what would be the next thing that you would experience in that downside right quadrant? And you can just go ahead and type it in the chat box just to prove a very important dimension of polarities, and that is their predictability. So one of the many gifts of polarities is their predictability. So yeah, you would need oxygen. I see everyone, not enough oxygen. I mean, this is just so obvious. And the reason, by the way, this particular metaphor is such a good one is because the feedback loop is so short, you instantly know what's going to happen next. And that's why this is a useful metaphor, because you know that you can't choose a pole as a solution. If you choose a pole as a solution, you're going to end up in the downside. So when we leverage this tension really well over time, it contributes to a greater purpose, which is not pictured, but it's the greater purpose statement is in the upside of both poles. It's kind of why even bother to leverage this polarity? And it's something along the lines of maintaining life or living, or something that actually both poles contribute to uniquely. And in this dynamic between the two, we are able to achieve this leverage. And if we have the downsides for too long, we get the deeper fear, which is an inability to maintain life. So this is a useful, and we can write exhale in that right pole too, just so you have both poles. Notice that both poles are both neutral or both positive. There's not a good and bad. They both contribute in unique ways, and they both have limitations. Now, this is not to say that we don't have preferences for certain poles, but now we're getting into probably some dimensions that go beyond this very simple metaphor. But if you get how this tension works, then you pretty much understand how all polarities work. There are two goods, getting oxygen and getting rid of carbon dioxide. And if you want to try to put it into a good and evil, where does the evil come from in polarities? It's the over-focus on one pole to the neglect of its interdependent pair. So you've got an evil in the form of too much carbon dioxide, and you've got an evil in the form of needing oxygen. And you've got two goods. So anyway, I'll leave it there. I hope that was helpful, Russ.
Thank you, Cliff. So Cliff noted, this is pretty obvious, right? Because it just happens every few seconds. And not all polarities are so obvious. So even in this example, you think, wow, the interdependency is so obvious. It would be ridiculous to say, I'm in the exhale camp. Everybody who's for exhale, join me. Or, to fight over inhaling versus exhaling. But it's the same kind of interdependency we're going to see in all those polarities that we just saw and the other ones that we're going to share. The other thing I want to note about this is, as Cliff was starting to describe, let's say you're just going along, inhaling and exhaling. Someone comes up behind you and grabs you from behind and puts his or her hand over your mouth and nose. You weren't paying attention to this polarity, but now you are. And so polarities come in and out of focus, and they particularly come into focus when they're not working well, or when they get interrupted, or when we start to get these downsides. Polarities are happening all the time around us. Most of them we manage or cope with pretty well. Sometimes, though, they get interrupted, and we start to get this kind of dispolarization. So that would lead us toward the deeper fear. But let's say you're driving to a meeting, you're late for it, the traffic is heavy, it's a really important meeting, you're still inhaling and exhaling. I wouldn't call that thriving, right? Like if you're really doing this well, you're thriving. But in polarity thinking, one of the things we want to pay attention to is not just bringing polarities into balance, but actually leveraging the polarity richly. So I could add a word on top here that might be thrive, right? If we're doing meditation or yoga or sports, we really pay attention to this cycle that we see here. We're thriving. If we're doing okay, kind of mediocre, inhaling, exhaling, I would call that balance. So let's jam together. And in terms of seeing polarities, what I like to do is to invite you all to a URL, which we're going to show on the screen here. So if you could, in a separate browser, browse to tinyurl.com/co-creative, you're going to get to a Google Jamboard. And I'm going to break you out into breakout groups. Oops. So on Zoom, we're going to basically create 10 breakout rooms. You'll end up in one of them. And as you'll see on the Jamboard, there are 10 boards. So you'll see at the top, it says something like 1 of 10, 1 over 10. So when you get into a group, you're going to see that your group has a number 1 through 10. And we would like all the members of your group to go to that Jamboard. So if you're breakout group number 5 in Zoom, you're going to go to Jamboard number 5, and that's where you're going to play together. So if you're having problems getting into Jamboard on that link, please let us know. But what you should be seeing will look like some pink, orange, and yellow Post-its laid out on a board. Okay. Is there anyone who's not able to get into the Jamboard? Excuse me. And while we're doing this, we'll also share a Jamboard on the screen so you can see at least one group that's working if for some reason you're not able to get in. Okay, so in just 30 seconds here, we're going to separate out into our 10 groups. You'll have about 4 to 5 people in each group. When you get into the group, please do a very quick round of introductions, maybe name, organization, and where you're physically located. And then your instructions are to take all those yellow cards that are on your Jamboard and match them up into polarities. So you'll see we started with some orange ones here where we've got the parts and the whole. That's one polarity. Being analytical in our work and being action-oriented in our work is another polarity. So the orange ones were kind of the starting sets that we wanted to give you to kick off. But what we're going to ask you to do is kind of work concurrently and kind of play with these and start to match them up into polarity pairs. So these are not things that are the same. They are things that are productive and positive opposites. And if you have questions, you can reach us in the chat. We'll be back together in about 5 minutes. Here we go. So if you haven't joined the breakout room yet, you should have received an invitation. Please accept the invitation to join your group.
All right, they're moving.
So Deborah and Mary Kay, if you're able to join your group, Navjeet is probably waiting for you.
Russ, it looks like Mary Kay Chess has not been able to join a group at this point.
Ah, okay. Hi, Mary Kay. Mary, look for a request here to join a group. You might receive it in a minute here. So any others having challenges getting into a group, please let us know. You're free to unmute and talk here too. Hi, Leslie.
Sorry, I'm so late. I had a scheduling snafu.
That's cool. They're doing the card sort exercise that we've done before. Leslie, you mind if I put you into a breakout group?
Not at all.
All right, I'm going to move you to one where there's a couple people.
Okay.
Oh, I forgot that it takes 60 seconds to actually close the breakout rooms.
Do you want to stay on this or go back to the PowerPoint immediately?
Let's ask if any groups think that they really solved it.
Cool.
Hey, Forrest.
Hi
Look
there,
like- Looks like you're in paradise.
Russ. Yeah, I'm in Portland, but it is nice and sunny out.
Nice.
All right, is everybody back?
To really be effective long term.
All right, welcome back, everyone. So I'm wondering if any of your teams felt like you really solved this, that you really found an optimal set of polarity pairs in this exercise. Is there any team that thinks you got it? Getting it means, in this case, you agreed with our take at it.
Russ, we were trying to just catch up with all the moving sticky notes.
Oh, okay. But you got some pairs, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So, so let's look at this here. We've got group 2. It looks like there's a lot of, oh, this looks like this group might have nailed it, I think. So yeah, our take at this, and obviously there might be some nuance, but you know, some other takes, but we definitely matched humility with confidence. That's, we think, particularly in leading collaboration, we think that's a particularly strong leadership polarity. So what does it look like when I approach my work and my relationships with high humility and high confidence? Self-interest and institutional interests, we often match self-interests with common good. And we can pull these up here. Individual interests and institutional interests, that's particularly important when people are connecting in collaborations and they need to be representing both of those and distinguishing between them. Getting the work done, building the relationships, visionary and practical. These are all things that we see show up whenever folks come together and they start to work together across any boundaries, functional boundaries, organizational, political, cultural, sectoral boundaries. And then as they start to decide on things together, you get into these preferences around those who want to just kind of keep things simple and those who seek deep understanding, those who are more intuitive in their approach, those who are more analytical. How long do we encourage debate before we have to converge on decisions and forge unity around what we're doing together? What interventions or strategies or offers are high leverage and also sellable or feasible? So all these things come into play. Again, we may not pay attention to most of these if they're working pretty well in any collaboration. They're usually just kind of happening in the background. But at the point that some of these, we start to experience some conflict or polarization, they can become very central in the work. And so the idea is, how do we make these, as they become come into focus, how do we make them really productive and, again, sources of constructive conflict, not sources of unconstructive polarization? So you win prizes if you agreed with us, but you also win prizes if you didn't agree with us. So I don't think that's a polarity, but that's just the way it is. And all these in the deck will be available. I saw there were a couple questions about that earlier. Oh, someone asked, is your take the one on the screen? Yes. Are all items matchable? Yes. And then Cecilia will follow up on your question.
So we wanted to move towards sketching some polarities. And so I'm going to just do some writing while Russ facilitates all of us to think through some upsides and downsides of some common polarities that show up in our work. So,
All right, so let's go to
yeah. Pulling it down.
playing with a couple of these. So there are 5 polarities that we've pulled up because in doing the work that we do right now, supporting about 20 multi-stakeholder collaborations, these are the ones that are the most consistently present and being worked on by the group, and where I think we often see the most potential for conflict and polarization. And this is one of those. So if we look at any issue, particularly at the community level, that's related to helping people who are marginalized or struggling in some way in the system, there's a polarity that shows up that can become very politicized very quickly. And we'll often see this particularly in issues like homelessness, addiction, like opioid addiction here in the US. We'll see this in any issue where there's the potential for an individual to help him or herself move forward productively, and where the community or some support system might be providing services and support to that individual. So we could call this a number of things. For these purposes, we just wanted to call it personal responsibility and community responsibility. So what we want to do here is create this map together real quick and crowdsource it from you all. So let's just say we're working on an issue at the community level and it has to do with education or homelessness or addiction or something like that. When we embrace, I'm going to start with the upsides of community responsibility. So when we really take seriously community responsibility and the provision of services and providing support to people in need who are experiencing, say, addiction or homelessness, what are some of the positive things that we get from that focus on community responsibility? So if you could go to the chat in Zoom and just start dropping things in, and we'll add them to the map here. So positive things, good things that we get when we focus on community responsibility in this work. So we have better communication and understanding, greater shared commitment, common goals, everyone is seen and heard, shared resources. Trish, I think that's Trish Hall from New Zealand. Hello, Trish. Says we get strong relationships. We get more resources brought to bear, and particularly more resources than an individual can get for him or herself. Leslie says a sense of solidarity, shared aggregate information, buy-in, community empowerment. And I would add too, something I haven't seen is real benefits for the community. So when we address these issues, we're not just strengthening individuals, we're strengthening our community as well. Sense of safety for everyone, and that goes to the the strength of the safety net. Greater sense of meaning, shared progress measures, etc. So this is many people participating in helping and supporting others who are in need. Now, let's go, we're kind of mapping this in what I think of as an appreciative way. Now let's go to the other side. If we look at personal responsibility, and that is people taking responsibility for themselves who are experiencing homelessness or addiction or something like that. As we foster personal responsibility, what kinds of benefits do we see? What good things come of that? So learning new skills, empowerment, less addiction. Less addiction may also go to our greater purpose, which we'll come to. A sense of self-worth, the benefits of tough love, lasting benefits for the individual, role models. So yeah, we get people who they were able to take personal responsibility, and now they've reached a point where they're able to help others and take responsibility for the well-being of others. We get a willingness to accept help from Emma, not accepting help from Emma, but Emma Chris shared that one. Accountability. We get this sense of new patterns and narratives are possible from Michiko. Ability to use resources. Kamal says sarcastically, the American dream. So that may actually come to some of the downsides. Let's come back to that one. That's a good one. And this sense of, in a way, I think Cliff is calling out this related polarity of community responsibility, and that has to do with unconditional love and unconditional acceptance. And then on the personal responsibility side, conditional respect. So I need you to step up and earn respect for yourself and with others. Agency. So now I'm guessing, because of the kind of work that we do, that in general, this group may tend to favor community responsibility. And I'm just, of course, stereotyped the whole group here. But so what I'd like to do is start with now, we're going to get downsides over time if we systematically embrace one of these values over time to the neglect of the other. And so if we embrace personal responsibility as the solution and the approach for homelessness or addiction, what kinds of downsides will we see when we systematically embrace personal responsibility to the neglect of community responsibility? So what are some of those? Codependence, get a job type thinking, like this is all your responsibility, you just need to get a job. It's very, very punitive kind of mindsets and approaches. People may not have the capacity to take care of themselves. And so we could ask for personal responsibility till we're blue in the face, and people may not be capable of it in some situations. We can get a real lack of empathy. I think that's a really common one that we see. Narrow perspective. Free riders we might see on the other side here. Charlie, what does that look like, free riders, if we're embracing personal responsibility?
Sorry, that belongs on the other side.
Okay. Stigmatizing.
Russ, I would have codependence on the other side as well.
Yeah, right.
But I may not. I'd like to hear from the person who thought codependence was the downside of personal responsibility, because there may be something I'm missing.
Yeah, that was Jennifer.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Yeah,
I agree.
So often when we're doing this in a room, any terms like that, I'm saying, say more, or what do you mean? What do you mean by that? So yeah, so we have this kind of like very individualistic kind of, if you're not succeeding, then it's your problem, it's your fault, it's your responsibility. Very much a focus on individual agency, when we know well enough that if a system is not functioning well, you can have all the agency possible and you still may not succeed.
So blame and scapegoating could probably end up here as well.
Yeah, and interestingly from Deanne here, a sense of entitlement if I'm succeeding, right? Like when I focus so much on personal responsibility and I don't have a sense of how I benefited from what the community is doing and taking responsibility for collectively, I can have this unrecognized privilege and sense of I got this because I earned it, right? Yeah,
and that's so interesting because I've done this map on this polarity with a number of different groups, and entitlement, when I see the word entitlement, it usually is in the downside of community to the neglect of personal responsibility. Mm-hmm. But in this case, who's the entitlement? Where's the entitlement? It's from the person who is overvaluing personal responsibility to the neglect of community. So there's this almost like a self-righteous indignation energy mm-hmm. that where the word entitlement comes in there, but you could also have entitlement in the downside of community, which is free riders. Entitlement from the standpoint of free riders and codependence.
Yeah, so the idea here is personal responsibility and community responsibility is a polarity not just for people who are marginalized or in down positions, but it affects everybody in that system and the way they perceive what's going on. So now let's say we said, okay, we're going to address this community issue, and we really need to it needs to be about the community, all about the community, full on, how do we provide services and support, et cetera. And we really neglect anything that's related to a sense of personal responsibility and individuals taking responsibility for their choices and behaviors. So if we're full on with community responsibility over time to the neglect of personal responsibility, we'll start to see some things like free riders and codependence and what other things, laziness.
Yeah, passivity. Oh, sorry, I'll type it in, sorry.
Yeah. A sense that I don't have to be responsible, someone will take care of this. One size fits all solutions. We'll see, we may see entitlement. And it's interesting, like even as we do this, right, to see it's easier to fill in some of these quadrants than others, right? And particularly this one is challenging. The downsides of community responsibility when we're living in the US context of a really high focus on and a high value around individualism and personal responsibility. And yet this map is why we often see things get so polarized, right? So Heather and I did this very map, or one very identical, in Humboldt County, California, around homelessness. And we were only doing this to open up the conversation space because people had, in some cases, stopped talking to one another about their take on this issue. And at the end of the mapping this, we were sitting down and we were debriefing, and one person who had a very conservative take and was very much in the personal responsibility camp turned to a homeless advocate next to her and said, you know, I think this is the first time we've had a real conversation together. Because she was seeing not just the wisdom in that other person's perspective, but having her own wisdom honored, and together they were experiencing the interdependency between their two positions. Cliff?
I was curious about NIMBY because in my thinking, and I may be missing something, I would have thought that that would be the result of over focusing on personal responsibility to the neglect of community, so that the downside would be, well, not in my backyard. And so that would be almost like a neglect of the community. It wouldn't be an over focus on the community, but I may be, see, here's where the values and language clarifications, like how does this tie in? But because I have seen so many times where the same words and the same perspective could actually show up in both downsides, and we just have to ask ourselves, because, like entitlement, because, like when I put entitlement, I didn't put a qualifier there. So I would say for the downside of community responsibility, entitlement, because I now no longer need to take personal responsibility because everyone else is taking it on for me.
Mm-hmm.
So, and we also have entitlement on the downside of the other pole, but that entitlement is from a different perspective. It's a sense of entitlement by a person who's already succeeding, that they don't want to help because, well, I worked to get what I want. So they've got this sense of entitlement that I shouldn't have to help. So let's see, NIMBY, I'm just looking at the.
Yeah. So let's just stay with, so NIMBY depends on who said that and what that person meant. I think that was Kamal, right? But having just heard what Cliff said, it would make sense for NIMBY to, in one form, be under personal responsibility. Focus on the individual interests and needs and responsibilities to the neglect of the collective responsibility, right?
Yeah, I agree with that. Just come on.
Yeah, I think the downside would be IMBY for community responsibility. It's like literally in your backyard. You're so focused on community responsibility that you've now opened up a homeless
Your own
shelter.
backyard.
Yeah.
Well, that was my grandmother who literally did that. So yeah, when I get to taking care of the community and taking care of myself, with my family history, you can probably guess where I fall out often on that polarity.
Yeah.
So yeah, we get these things, dynamics though, that happened around these, even though when we map it out together, particularly in a diverse group, we can see the ridiculousness of just choosing one of these. But often in a community context, we're correcting one another. So a quick story about that. This was a leadership group for a set of collective impact initiatives in the US here. And they had gotten very polarized around and triggered by an issue related to Standing Rock and Native American rights. And there was a long history with conflict between Native communities and the white community in this area in the country. And so we were having a late night meeting with this leadership team, and I was there meeting with them. It was raining outside. We're in a really cramped conference room, and we were unpacking what people were thinking and feeling about what had emerged. And I notice people are using the word equity and throwing the word equity around. And one guy, as we're doing this, starts sitting back from the table. Eventually he crosses his arms. And then at some point, he's not making eye contact with anyone else. So my intervention was simply to say, let's stop. I want to go around and hear from each of you. When you hear the word equity, what does it mean to you? And we had some really textbook definitions. We had, and then we had some other community leaders would say, well, it really means fairness, but fairness that recognizes individual circumstances, et cetera. And then we get to this person who was kind of like stepping back from the group, and he said, because I respect you all, I'm going to be honest. When I hear the word equity, it means people taking without giving back. And this was a conservative person who had been very involved in this work. And if anyone saw what he was doing, any one of us would say he's doing equity work. But he was triggered by that word in the political context. And from the perspective of this map, where was his concern? So he was concerned that we were using equity to mean people taking without giving back. If we look down the bottom right there, community responsibility, that's where he was, yeah, Jennifer noted that. That's where he thought we were working, was that we were basically going to say, hey, people aren't personally responsible for their choices, but we're just going to provide them with lots of services and support and programs and et cetera. And so I asked the rest of the team, I said, is that what you mean by the word equity? And they said, no, obviously we have to foster people taking responsibility for themselves and even giving back to the community when they're able, et cetera. And you could see this visible, he kind of just breathed out the stress and conflict and tension because we honored the whole polarity. And then he was back doing again what any of us would consider equity work. Right. So I think we'll move on here, but typically we're not leveraging polarities just because it's, you know, what we do instead of going to movies on Saturday night. We're doing it because there's some greater purpose. So if we take homelessness or addiction as examples, and we look at this polarity of personal responsibility and community responsibility, what might be a few words, and you could drop them in the chat, that would get to what's the greater purpose? What will the greater good be when we leverage this polarity really well in a community? Cohesiveness from Leslie. So we're really maximizing the upsides of both poles, really minimizing the downsides. So we're getting better communication, better understanding, shared commitment, the safety net, and accountability, self-worth, empowerment. Bringing everyone up, engagement, better quality of life for everyone, zero homelessness, more intelligent use of resources. Yeah, and one thing we've noticed is that often the greater purpose has either the word thriving or resilient or both. So a cohesive, connected, engaged, and thriving community that makes intelligent use of its resources. Now, if we start to get in the downsides of one of these because of the dynamics of polarization, I start pushing, like, I think we need more community responsibility, and other people think that I'm asserting socialism, which is a bad word in the US in some cases. And then other people start pushing for more personal responsibility. Things get more and more polarized. We create this vicious cycle leading to a deeper fear. And one of the things in a polarity is everyone is trying to get away from some common deeper fear. So what might be some words that would reflect a deeper fear in this case? So disconnection, loneliness, unintended consequences of our actions, vilification, alienation, things taken from me might be a perception that falls into one of the downsides, maybe particularly community responsibility. I have a sense that I'm going to have to lose in order for these folks to gain. So yeah, often a word that shows up here is failure, right? Or implosion, or just deepening conflict or isolation. So that's the essential map. I think we want to share the other 4 tensions that we often see showing up in this work.
The 5 key tensions?
Yeah. So quick wins and systemic change. In the Clean Electronics Production Network, which is a multi-sector collaborative focused on eliminating worker exposures to hazardous chemicals. The NGOs were really pushing for one of these, and the company representatives were really pushing for another. And we finally just said, okay, let's map this. And we went up to a wall and we mapped it. And the dynamic shifted within 20 minutes. So who do you think was pushing for which? Ryan, we will share the completed map. Yeah. So the company reps were really pushing for quick wins. They needed to show their companies that stuff was happening, that the time and money they were spending on this collaboration, particularly with NGOs that had attacked them in the past over this issue, they needed to show evidence in order to get more engagement from their companies. And the NGO folks were really pushing for, we need to change the entire way this system is working in fundamental ways. And once we mapped this, we saw, great, these quick wins, they build momentum, they bring more resources, they attract more attention, we get more engagement. And if we do that to the neglect of systemic change, we're just gonna kind of be working at the margins for 10 years and nothing's really gonna change, and vice versa. So we'll just see the others here. I think we have building relationships and advancing the work. Differentiation and integration, kind of a very general one, but how do we really differentiate the diverse interests and needs of stakeholders in a network or collaboration? And how and where do we need to get alignment, integration, agreement, et cetera? So that's a very kind of core one that we see. And then learning and action. Some people love to spend a lot of time learning and researching and studying a system before they develop strategy. And others say, let's just start working and we'll figure out the strategy. And that can be very polarizing, right? Because people have these different preferences. But if you think about it, that polarity is the basis of action learning. So the question isn't, do we do one or the other, but how do we create an action learning cycle where we're taking action, we're observing what happened, we're generalizing that, and then adjusting our strategy, integrating the learning into our approach. So these are some specific tensions that have shown up in different networks. Oops, if we can just go back for a sec. We in fact we're working with some of these last week. The tension between healthcare really doing procurement, for example. And one of the ones that we played with actually last week, and so these are health systems that are working to address economic determinants of health. We met with the multi-state systems, so big health systems that operate in multiple states, and we mapped a polarity between the kind of system-wide perspective, so like Kaiser Permanente, the kind of central entity, and the local perspective, and people said, "Wow, for the first time, I'm seeing like." An explanation for what we've been struggling with for many years now, just by exploring that polarity together. Okay. So we're going to do some visual stuff here, and I'll just talk through some things to watch for. So if we look at this, the next slide. One of the things I love about polarities is that it illuminates concepts that I was familiar with, but gives them new life and new meaning. So for example, if we talk about tunnel vision or blind spots or vicious cycles or virtuous cycles or stereotyping or corrections, we all know these words and we probably have an understanding of the dynamics, but they take on new meaning and new richness from a polarity perspective. So the ones in bold here, we're just going to kind of play with a little bit and see what they look like. And again, we'll be sharing all the documents that we're creating here together. And others, you're welcome to well, attend a training for polarity partnerships, or we have other materials like slide decks and things that would illuminate some of these others. So, tunnel vision. We kind of talked about this a bit, and that is there are two views on this map. Can somebody name which two quadrants would be two parts of the same kind of view or perspective? So think of an individual, somebody who's very liberal maybe, or somebody who's maybe very conservative. When they look at that situation, homelessness or addiction, which two quadrants would they tend to focus on to the neglect of the other two?
The top right and the bottom left.
Yeah, and vice versa, right, Kamal? So, so when we talk about tunnel vision, I am generally very present to the benefits of my own preference in this polarity. If I'm an advocate for homeless services and support, and I operate kind of automatically, instinctively out of this sense of community responsibility, I will very much be looking at the situation and seeing the benefits of community responsibility and the downsides of that thing that I might call selfishness. Whereas if I'm, say, more libertarian or maybe more conservative when I approach this issue, I might positively stereotype the benefits of personal responsibility, and I look at that other stuff, that kind of like communist or socialist crap or whatever, and I want nothing to do with that. And so even when someone says to me the words community responsibility, I may react to that, right? And because what I see when I look at personal responsibility from or community responsibility, I don't see those upsides. My tunnel vision has me seeing the downsides of that. So, so both of these are true. Both of these are in some sense accurate. Both of these perspectives contain some kind of essential wisdom, but they are incomplete. And so when Cliff talks about the importance of when you do these maps, make sure you've got the diversity in the room. Mapping a polarity like this with a group that's homogeneously liberal is going to be a very difficult process. Cliff, other things on tunnel vision or this dynamic of, we could also talk about stereotyping.
I guess the only thing I would add is there's, in every single polarity map, there's a differentiation and an integration dimension. The differentiation is in the two diagonals. That's how the 2 points of view tend to show up. And that's the polarization. And so without a both-and lens, those two dimensions of the two diagonals on the negative to positive end up creating polarization that's rooted in either or thinking to the neglect of both and thinking. And so if you don't have a way to see the tension as a both and, which the polarity map reveals, then we're stuck in which is it going to be? Do you want this downside to this upside or this downside to this upside? Which is it? And it's essentially a false choice. And the ability to map it out with key stakeholders helps everybody to see where their preferences might be and where actually there's a vulnerability to their preference. And so everybody owns a piece of the responsibility and the tension. And once you've seen how the dynamic works, you can't unsee it. And so the real gift there is that you can still have your point of view, but you recognize that your point of view is actually in the context of an ongoing dynamic that's essentially never going away. It's unsolvable.
Yeah. And so many of you have probably seen those figure ground relationships where you look at it one way and you see two faces, and you look at it another way and you see a vase. That dynamic of once you see those two things, you cannot unsee them. That's one of the powerful things about polarity thinking, right? Once you start to see the polarities, you won't unsee it. So it's a total 100% gain. So one of the other dynamics is we know that people, even when they share a greater purpose, can reasonably have these kind of different perspectives or value orientations. But they also may have different recommendations for how we get away from our deeper fear and toward our greater purpose. And so the pathway for somebody who prefers personal responsibility would look like, okay, we're going to get away from failure by moving away from the downsides of community responsibility, because I'm repulsed by that, and embracing more of this upsides of personal responsibility. And that's how we're going to get up to that greater purpose, right? So that's my program. That's all of my recommendations are probably going to come out of something related to that view of getting away from that crap that's the downsides of personal responsibility and embrace or community responsibility and embracing personal responsibility. Someone else can reasonably have the exact opposite pathway away from the deeper fear and toward the greater purpose. And where those cross each other in the middle, that's that point of polarization and conflict. And the word that we often use for this dynamic is corrections, right? Like if Cliff starts to assert, well, we need more community responsibility because we're going to get, better use of resources and stronger relationships and, a real safety net or whatever, I just start to react against that. And I start pushing for, no, you're going to get codependence and free riders and laziness and passivity. What we really need is X. And even before Cliff says a word in a meeting, I start to correct him, right? It's like an anticipatory correction. Cliff, I know what you're going to say, and we really need to double down on this personal responsibility program.
Silence, Cliff.
Like streets to jobs, yeah. So another thing that will happen here is as people bump up against each other and start to correct each other, it starts to feed a vicious cycle, right? And so one of the things that Cliff asserted early on when I was learning from him was when you start to get the downsides of one pole in a polarity, over time, you'll eventually get the downsides of both. And I was like, that intuitively makes sense. I've seen that, but what's actually going on there? And it's this like deepening correction, almost like from a survival perspective. I've really got to fix your perspective because you are so wrong. And your perspective cannot coexist with mine. And it creates this kind of vicious cycle that actually brings us closer to our shared deeper fear. A good example is in the US, we had the Patriot Act. Okay, the Patriot Act is a policy, is a piece of legislation designed to protect the freedoms of Americans. And it did so by limiting the freedoms of Americans. So you start to see these even like policy solutions that are reflective of this lowest common denominator kind of vicious cycle. But when folks can see the interdependency and they can see the value in both perspectives, that starts to generate this virtuous cycle that's generative and affirming and mutually reinforcing, and that can lead us toward our greater purpose. So Cliff mentioned earlier predicting the future. And one of the things you can tell, like when I go into an organization and I say, hey, do you have a value statement or a statement of your core values? As soon as I see that list, I can tell what's coming for that organization. So, and we've done this. Well, there's one I can't share, but I think we could anonymize it and share it. But if you go into an organization and say, we have a core value of including everyone in decisions, what might you predict for that might happen in the future of that organization? You can already predict the future because you know polarities. Yeah, you might get analysis paralysis, right? Now, it probably depends a lot on the process, et cetera, but you might just get, Cliff said, chaos. And it depends on what we mean by that, et cetera, right? But often we'll see this like overutilized value, like accountability. If you've ever been in an organization that says we're all about accountability, at some point, I can guarantee you that support is going to assert itself, because people can't just have accountability, they need support. So we'll look at another way to think about this at 3 levels of leveraging polarities.
And we are going to wrap. We have 1 minute left.
Yep.
So this is just a way to look at polarities that you might be experiencing in your own collaborations. We're not going to do a poll on it, but it was more just a tool that we were offering up for you all to be able to do some self-assessment.
And maybe assessments of your collaboratives.
And then we also have in the slide deck that we'll share right after the call, just some easy preventions and interventions that might be useful to you as you're working with your collaborations or networks. And then we also are offering up a few sort of practices you might consider taking on to just hone that polarity thinking muscle. And so there's a number of sort of practice items you could take up. And we wanted to call out that if this sort of piqued your interest around polarity thinking, we would highly recommend getting some advanced training from Polarity Partnerships. So that's what we've got for the call today. We appreciate you all coming on. And like I mentioned at the top, we're happy to stick around for some time after this call for anybody who does have some time on their calendars right now who wants to engage in some conversation.
So more resources coming. And if you're interested in more, please let us know, and also reach out to Polarity Partnerships.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.